In this 3-minute game review, we're looking at Brok the Investigator, so hit that subscribe button and let's get into it. Brok the Investigator is a story-driven, point-and-click detective game with some beat-em-up and RPG elements, similar to games like Detective Grimoire and Detective Leclue, but with a small dash of punching and kicking added into the mix. Brok the Investigator may not have an award-winning art style, but the quirky and colourful 2D sprites certainly gave off some early 2000s browser-based Flash games nostalgic vibes. Not to mention, the game also has a catchy soundtrack and is also fully voiced with some phenomenal voice acting.
What the heck is that abomination of a machine near the door?
Abomination? You mean the circular saw? Pretty neat, huh?
Neat? That thing almost killed me!
Well, you know, the slums aren't very safe for lone women. So, I built this ultimate crime detection device.
There are two main gameplay loops. The first is an action mode where you engage in simple beat-em-up gameplay, fighting NPCs or bashing objects and sometimes brute forcing your way through puzzles. While the second is a point-and-click detective investigation gameplay loop. Most of the game requires that you know when and where to switch between both modes in order to progress through the puzzles and investigation. For example, breaking open a glass cabinet to get your hands on an important item, which you'll have to figure out where and what you can interact that item with in order to progress. Which means that you will need to know what you're doing rather than trying out every item in every spot. During police investigations, you will also need to mix and match statements and theories, which will either force a confession out of suspects or push them to reveal new information that will help you to make better conclusions to the case that you're trying to solve. Although the player has some agency over the choices in the game, many of the choices aren't super meaningful, and I wish there were more options at times instead of a simple yes or no. For example, not being given the option to negotiate or compromise, while other times I felt a little railroaded when it came to different approaches to solving a problem or a case. The beat-em-up mechanics were also really simplistic, and despite some options when it came to leveling up, there really isn't much in the way of building up your character's stats. That said, most of the other elements play a secondary role to the solid and otherwise well-designed point-and-click detective mechanics, which at the end of the day make up the core elements of the game. The game has one of the most diverse and interesting cast of characters, which further enhance an otherwise largely linear and straightforward detective story experience. Despite the lack of choice and branching arcs, Brok's story was definitely a heartfelt and memorable one. Despite an interesting attempt to mesh two very different genres of games together, Brok the Investigator is nothing new nor groundbreaking. But at its core, Brok the Investigator is still a solid point-and-click detective adventure with a great, if otherwise linear story. I would only recommend Brok the Investigator to fans of simple point-and-click adventures who don't mind a linear and straightforward storyline. If you're craving for more story-driven games, check out our other videos. Otherwise, like and subscribe for more 3-minute game reviews.